Hi, I'm Jay Marshall, and I'm really excited about urban history, particularly that of the latter part of the 20th century, dealing with urban renewal and deindustrialization and attempts of cities to recover it, and especially those efforts in Springfield, Massachusetts. And really, Springfield peaked in 1988 when the New York Times celebrated in a headline, crown jewel for the city's downtown, the $111 million mixed use Monarch Place. And that building even had endangered species nesting on the upper floors. I know because I had a key because there was a cable camera in an office up there. And if the birds moved off camera, I would have to go up and check because people would call security and ask us if the birds were okay. And yet, 4 short years later, the building would be $235 million in debt, more than twice what it cost to build it. And it would be sold a year later to the owner of Peter Pan Bus Lines, also headquartered in Springfield, for just $24 million at auction, less than a quarter of what it cost to build it. One of its marquee tenants, the Bank of New England, failed largely because of $6.2 billion in bad real estate loans. What went wrong? You can't tell by reading about it because there's no real story in the literature about it. It's more known for its colonial, American Revolutionary, and Industrial Revolutionary history than it is the 20th century. And all of that's well detailed by Frank Bauer Jr. in his At the Crossroads, Springfield, Mass., 1636 to 1975. Donald D'Amato in his Springfield 350 Years, a Pictorial History, much weightier than a pictorial history. Town into City, Springfield, Massachusetts, and the Meaning of Community, 1840 to 1880 by Michael Frisch. Guy McLean's Pioneer Valley, a Pictorial History, also not just a pictorial history. Michael Koenig and Martin Kaufman's Springfield, 1636 to 1986. And they all share an emphasis on a glorious past, the pioneering, hardscrabble ways of making, and then the Industrial Revolution and how dominant Springfield was, and then the bad times, and then, an epilogue about urban renewal projects and how it's going to be this glorious future and all these new buildings. They turn it in the urban core into Frederick Jackson Turner's New Frontier. Performers like Jane Jacobs might want to chime in on that, but the 20th century was not kind to Springfield. Its industries and facilities had become increasingly obsolete even before the striking of the Great Depression. And it placed its economic recovery hopes on the only game in town, the federal government. And as those large-scale urban renewal projects failed to work, they doubled down and sought more public and private large-scale projects to replace those as they sought to transition from a blue-collar, high-wage, low-skilled economy that allowed working men to buy houses to a young urban professional, white collar business type of center without regard for whether businesses needed office space and wanted to relocate or if the local people had the skills for those types of jobs. We could walk around the streets near Monarch Place, perhaps not at this time of day because it's not safe, and see the many monuments to that building boom. And a lot of that was captured again by Michael Koenig. Uh, I had the pleasure of being his grad assistant. He is the expert on the closing of the Armory. He authored A Study in Leadership, Springfield and its Mayors, 1945 to present, and with James O'Connell, Shaping an Urban Image, A History of Downtown Planning in Springfield, Massachusetts. And what a glorious time it was. Downtown area was littered with office towers, some complete, some under construction, and there were the Koenig books, and most of them had an introduction by then Mayor Richie Neal, now the ranking member of the Ways and Means Committee, with all the access to that economic funding. And in reading those books, you might get the idea that Springfield lived happily ever after and prospered. But that's not what happened. Rather, shortly after all those ribbon cuttings and celebrations and fanfare, the real estate bubble, which many of those projects helped to inflate, popped. In the region, Springfield, New England as a whole entered the recession far earlier than the 1990s and experienced it much deeper and for much longer and came out of it much later than the rest of the country. But that's not told in the history of Springfield. There's a huge gap. And there's no attention to the question of why that happened and why all that failed. Were these poorly conceived projects? Were they poorly administered? Was there corruption? Was there crime? What does it reveal about the plight of mid-sized cities like Springfield? Why were these questions never asked? Was it because the city was so dependent on this funding that They didn't want to risk it? Is it because politicians were so dependent on getting this funding to get reelected, they didn't want to risk it? Or was it because there was no funding available to do this kind of research? It had all dried up. These are some of the questions I want to take a look at. Was this all just a continuation of the policies of complacency and denial that had really afflicted Springfield since the 1920s? There's been more recent treatment on these topics. Timothy Black, who was at the University of Hartford, worked for the Regional Employment Board, he wrote, "When a Heart Turns Rock Solid, the Lives of Three Puerto Rican Brothers on and Off the Street," which was an ethnography kind of pulled from the 1920s urban sociologists of the Chicago School, identity politics and underserved populations. I actually had one of those youth on my caseload, and I sent him to work, sent him to school, and he ended up back in jail, unfortunately. Robert Ferrant, who's at the University of Massachusetts at Lowell, wrote a detailed history of the closing of the American Bosch plant in Springfield. It was his dissertation in part because he had worked there and worked his way up to being the business manager. He pulled from Barry Bluestone and Bennett Harrison in their work on deindustrialization. Gail Radford wrote a work on public authorities and actually did a case study on Springfield and the many buildings that its parking authority had built and how those had not necessarily ended up well. Timothy Plant, who was the chief administration and financial officer for the city of Springfield, wrote A Triumphant Springfield Resurgence: How a Proud City Built a Fiscally Sustainable Future. But he's really talking about how the city finally got out from underneath the control board put in place by the state. So this is what I want to study, and I want to take that journey. So thank you.